Shadows in the winter. A winter night, the frosty wind swept through the empty streets of a small town where the everyday bustle had quieted. Only one house, and standing at the edge, seemed to draw out all the world's emotions. The light from its windows was ominous, like a sign that something more than just a cold winter evening lurked behind its walls. Irina sat on an old sofa in the dark room, lighting a cigarette. A thin stream of smoke rose upwards, sliding along the walls, leaving invisible traces of the past. Her eyes were empty. They no longer asked anything. They had long since stopped hoping. Beside her stood her husband, Alexander. He breathed heavily, but not from the cold. It was something else, something heavy, weighing down his soul. "You're doing it again," Alexander said, his lips pressed tight. His voice sounded like the creak of old doors. Irina said nothing. She watched herself take another drag from the cigarette, swallowing the bitterness that had accumulated over the years. She knew they were no longer one. She knew that this house was no longer their home. "You don't understand, Alexander. You never even tried to understand," she finally spoke. "I don't understand," he asked, stepping closer. His words seemed thrown into the void, without hope of a response. "You live in your world and I live in mine." Irina lifted her gaze, her eyes full of despair. "You don't hear me, and you don't want to hear." Alexander stood still, as if frozen in time, trying to find a word that could break this silence. Eventually he said, "Maybe I'm tired of fighting too." Irina felt a heavy weight in her chest. They were both wounded, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that all that remained was emptiness. "So what now?" she asked, looking at him as if she wanted him to give her an answer that would change everything. But Alexander just stood there silently, for neither he nor she could change what had happened. A snowstorm began to fall. It tapped faintly on the window, but their hearts were already deaf to the sound. Irina flicked the cigarette into the ashtray, staring at the fading light. She couldn't stop thinking about how everything had gone wrong, how they had once been in love, how they laughed together until they cried, how they dreamed of the future. Now between them stood a wall of silence, and even their gazes no longer found each other. Alexander sat beside her, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. "Maybe we just stopped seeing each other." His voice was firm, but there was something in it Irina couldn't recognize. Sorrow, anger, or despair. "We became strangers," she replied, and the words seemed to echo in the empty space that had become their life. She looked at him and suddenly realized how long it had been since they had spoken to each other. How long since they had laughed together, shared little joys, and how quickly this rift had become ordinary for them. "We became different," Alexander said, "but we could try." Irina interrupted him, tilting her head as if those words had hurt her. "Try? We've already tried, Alexander, and it didn't work. We both changed. And it's not just about us, it's about everything that happened between us." She remembered the last year, times when they still tried to save their relationship, when he came home late and she only heard the sound of his phone's beep. When confidence in their words and their gestures began to fade. Instead of tender conversations, there were cold questions. Instead of touch, silence. To turn things back to the way they were? Did you really believe that was possible? She stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the snow falling down, striking the ground like endless questions without answers. There was pain in her eyes that she couldn't hide, pain from everything having turned different, from everything that had once mattered now being a shadow. "I don't know what I want," Alexander whispered, "but I know this can't just end like this. I'm still trying to understand why we're here, why we're no longer together, even though everything started so differently." Irina felt her heart freeze at his words. She turned to him, her gaze firm, though filled with disappointment. "We can't just walk out of this, Alexander. I don't know what happened to us, but I can't just wait for you to finally see what's wrong with us." Silence stretched between them, becoming even heavier as Alexander didn't respond. His eyes were shut off from emotions, feeling as though his inner world was collapsing. But he was afraid to admit that they had truly sunk into an abyss from which there was no escape. I'm afraid we've lost each other. I'm afraid you don't see me. You no longer hear me, Alexander said, his voice trembling. Irina sat back down on the sofa, feeling the cold creeping deeper than just her skin. She understood that he was afraid because she herself felt that same fear. But again, she chose silence, even as her heart beat harder, trying to understand why everything was so complicated, why nothing was working. Maybe we just took different paths, she whispered, and we'll never return. These words were a verdict, and everything around them froze. The shadows from the lamp grew longer, and the snow outside the window swallowed everything that was outside. They sat in silence, realizing there was no way back. Alexander quietly sighed, bowing his head. His heart beat like it was trapped in a small cage, and his thoughts scattered like uncharted worlds that could never be retraced. He felt how hard it was to breathe, as though his world had been held together by a thread that was about to snap. Maybe we're just too afraid, he whispered, but the words lacked the strength they needed. They couldn't change what had happened. They couldn't bring back those moments when they were close, when their eyes met and the world seemed completely different. Irina stood up, her movements slow, almost as if in a dream. She walked to the window again, her gaze directed at the snow that continued to fall, creating strange pictures on the surface of the darkness. She wished that this snow could take away all her pain, all the questions left unanswered. We were afraid to leave everything that came before, she said, her voice quieter than before. But we didn't realize that we weren't just afraid of change, but of losing ourselves. Alexander didn't respond. His inner conflict, his fears and doubts, all collided in his mind like torn pieces of a broken canvas. He couldn't give her what she longed for, and maybe he couldn't even give it to himself anymore. She understood. She understood that over time, they had built barriers without even noticing. At first, everything seemed like small misunderstandings and disagreements, nothing more than temporary difficulties they could overcome. But now, when those difficulties had become familiar, they didn't know how to return to what they once wanted. Maybe this is our final stop, Irina added, and there was an overwhelming certainty in her words that didn't allow for discussion. I can't be naive anymore. I can't hope for something that's no longer there. The shadow on her face grew more pronounced, and it seemed that every word she said cut deep into Alexander's soul like a knife. He felt his heart break into pieces. They had both lost the ability to turn back. Time was irreversible, and all that remained was to acknowledge their defeat. Maybe you're right. His voice was heavy, and he couldn't hold back the anxiety that had been building inside him. Maybe we really took different paths, but I'm still not ready to let you go. Irina turned to him, her gaze sharp, almost cold. But you already let me go, Alexander. You let me go a long time ago, and I let you go. You just didn't notice. These words were like a blow to his consciousness, and he remained silent, feeling his shoulders drop as the weight on his heart disappeared. His despair mingled with the realization that, in fact, he had been part of the problem. He hadn't seen, hadn't known her pain, her sorrow, her inner struggle. I don't know what to do, he whispered, looking at her. He couldn't hold on to the illusion that everything could be fixed. All their shared dreams had scattered into small pieces that couldn't form a whole. Irina didn't respond. She simply stood there, as though stripped of all hope, looking at him with a gaze that said it all. She was ready to end this chapter. She no longer waited for change. She no longer searched for words that could save their love, because those words had long since faded. We can't be together anymore, she said with finality that left no room for argument. Those words echoed through the room like the last creak of old doors. All the emotions, all the pain, all the questions with no answers. They were all in those words. Alexander sat still, like stone. He could no longer say anything. Irina stood, looking at him, and then, unable to bear the silence any longer, she quietly added, "We no longer know how to love." And everything went silent. Only the snow outside the window continued its silent fall, covering the ground with a new layer of cold and shadow. They no longer had each other, but even that had become part of their past.